Khalistani separatist Gurpatwant Singh finds himself at the center of a second diplomatic storm. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo story. Diplomatic ripples are being created by a front page lead in the Financial Times that says that America thwarted a bid to assassinate Khalistani terrorist Gurpatwant Singh on US soil. The article goes on to say that Washington warned India and shared its inputs with the foreign ministry here. India has said that these inputs are being taken seriously and they talk about a nexus between gun runners, terrorists, and others. Now, remember, this article comes soon after Canadian allegations made by Justin Trudeau himself that India or India-affiliated agencies were responsible for the killing of another Khalistani, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, on Canadian soil. Ironically, Pannun is the lawyer for Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Most recently, Pannun made an open incitement to violence, threatened to target Air India planes. Previously, he has targeted Indian diplomats. He has also targeted the Hindu community in Canada. Nobody can quite explain why Pannun is not behind bars. The Hindustan Times earlier reported Ajit Doval, that's what the paper quoted him saying, the national security advisor, as having told the CIA director that India believes that Pannun is, quote unquote, a CIA agent. A lot to unpack here. Let's introduce a panel of experts as we look at this developing story. Joining us from Canada today is Terry Milewski. He's one of the world's foremost experts on the Khalistan project, so to speak. Good to see you, Terry, after a while. Sanjay Lazar. Sanjay himself is a victim of the Kanishka bombing. That was, of course, the handiwork of Khalistani groups. He lost his entire family on board that plane and has since spent many years of his life trying to get justice in that case. Also joining us is veteran diplomat, Ambassador Dileep Sinha. Always a pleasure, sir. Joining us today is Suhasini Haidar. She's one of India's best-known strategic affairs experts and editor with the Hindu newspaper. And also joining us is veteran diplomat, Ambassador Manjeev Puri. Let me welcome everybody to the program. Thank you very much, everybody. And let me just start by getting a perspective from you, Ambassador Sinha, if I may. What did you think when you first read the FT article?
I was a little intrigued by it, Barkha, because if the Americans have leaked the information, why would they choose a British newspaper for it? And FT has not quoted any sources. So we don't know whether FT has got its news from British intelligence because of the sharing that the Five Eyes have of intelligence information, or whether the Americans have chosen to give it to the Financial Times. What is also intriguing is that this has come just about the time when Justin Trudeau joined Prime Minister Modi in the G20 virtual summit. So it seemed as if the Niger affair was getting behind us and that India-Canada relations were coming back on track. India has just resumed the e-visas for Canadian nationals. So just when India-Canada relations were coming back on track, we have this news coming out in the Financial Times. And from there, it's been picked up by the Indian media, by the Pakistani media, and it's being played up. Pannu, of course, as you yourself mentioned, is an extremely controversial figure. Very recently, he had threatened to bomb the World Cup final itself, not to mention Air India aircraft. So again, it's very odd that Pannu should be in this controversy, and the newspaper does not mention that America has accused India of trying to kill him. It's just that there seemed to be a plot there. So this is extremely intriguing, and we'd like to hear a little more from sources. The Americans have refused to comment. Our comment is as it should be, that we'll investigate and look into the matter. But it's very difficult to comment on this kind of sketchy information, which surprisingly has been carried as a top headline by the Financial Times. So that itself is extremely intriguing. We'll have to wait and see what emerges from this.
Right. And just to be clear, Pannun has dual citizenship. He's a citizen of both the United States of America and Canada. Many of his public rallies and open incitement to violence have been from Canada, but the Americans could act against him as well and have chosen not to. Terry, what do you make of the FT piece?
Well, it's certainly bad news for the Indian side in this. If this story is true, and by the way, they do suggest in the Financial Times that they do have sources in the American National Security Council. It's not completely unsourced, but you can believe it or not, but it is, any way you slice it, bad news for the Indian side, because it's one thing to be up against Canada, not exactly a superpower by any means, and certainly dwarfed by the political muscle wielded by India. But now, if the United States is effectively joining sides with Canada, saying, yes, you are indeed, you, India, running assassination plots in extraterritorially in both Canada and the United States, then this is going to be trouble. We're not going to let you get away with this. Remember that right from the start, the Americans did weigh in on Canada's behalf, saying, yes, we got similar intelligence and we conveyed that intelligence to the Canadians. We stand behind them. And most recently, in his meeting with Secretary Blinken and Dr. Jaishankar, his Indian counterpart, Blinken repeated this most recently, saying, look, we do want you to cooperate with the Canadians in investigating this matter. So the pressure is building on the Indians to do more than just poo-poo it and say it's absurd. Well, if it's absurd, how come the Americans apparently have got a sealed indictment already? In other words, their investigation has already proceeded far beyond the Canadian one, to the point where they've actually laid a charge. A sealed indictment, to be sure, but according to this story, they are now weighing whether to make it public or to wait for the Canadians to conclude their investigation. That may be a long wait.
So you believe that this shows a certain amount of collaboration, once again, between the Americans and the Canadians, Terry?
Yeah, they're on the same team here, and they're ratcheting up the pressure on the Indians, saying, look, it's not enough to just say it's absurd and we haven't seen the evidence. We've laid it out for you. You can't keep saying we haven't given you any evidence. The problem for the Canadians is that they haven't laid their cards on the table publicly. They haven't persuaded Canadians or citizens of the world anywhere that they really have the goods. It's time for somebody to lay those cards on the table and stop making excuses for a complete lack of transparency.
Let me actually take this to Ambassador Manjeev Puri. The Indian response is quite different from the response when Trudeau made his allegations on the killing of Niger. Perhaps, as Ambassador Sinha makes the point, that it's not clear from the FD article whether it's India that's being accused. In fact, the foreign ministry chose to describe it as a nexus between gun runners, terrorists, and others, not seeing it as an accusation against Indian agencies. But Terry makes the point that in general, for India, trying to spread a kind of global awareness around the patronage of men, terrorists rather, like Gurpatwant Pannun, this is a setback. Do you see the contents of the Financial Times article to be a setback?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Barkha, thank you. You had invited me to your program several weeks back, and I had told you, let's avoid this evidence business. You know, we need to understand quite clearly that Mr. Trudeau wasn't all by himself, although he may have gone out on a leg and done what I believe was not the right diplomatic way and not a governmental way of going about doing these things. Having said all this particular thing is, I understand what my colleague Ambassador Dilip Sinha is saying, but this is exactly like many people feared. These things are engineered, they are done in this sort of a manner, and frankly speaking, what the indictment has, what they know, etc., we really won't know. But yes, I mean, I have to agree with Terry, it does put you on a back foot in the sense that at least there is one other player, somebody that you are also having a evolving very high level good relationship. That country where the credibility issues are of a different order, nobody is saying that the US administration has a domestic issue, etc. So it does become a little, let me say, problematic. But I think on the other hand, let's not also jump to different kinds of conclusions that you did it, etc. Not at all. Nothing of that kind has been said. And let's wait and watch. I do think a certain degree of messiness stands created.
Yeah, let me bring it to Hasani at that point. How much tougher? does this make it for the Indian argument, Suhasini?
Well, I think we have to really put down a few things. The first seems to be, as both the diplomats have said, that the Canadian allegations were not a one-off. They are now joined by the U.S., not just in sort of supporting their allegations, as the other Five Eye partners had, but the U.S. seems to have its own allegations. In this particular case, yes, the article came out in the Financial Times, which is a British paper, but the White House didn't lose any time in confirming the contents of that article. And now the Ministry of External Affairs has made it clear that, in fact, that article is correct, that the US officials did raise the issue of a potential targeting of Gurpatwant Singh Pannun, somebody that India has wanted for a while, and who has just most recently issued threats against Air India. And that these concerns were raised during Prime Minister Modi's state visit to Washington. So, given the kind of affirmation or the confirmation that we have got both now from a White House spokesperson on the record, named spokesperson, as well as the Ministry of External Affairs' spokesperson, I think it is necessary for the government to obviously take it much more seriously, and to perhaps be a little more open, shed some of the secrecy. Although, of course, these are national security issues, but shed some of the secrecy, because so much is coming out in the public domain from officials. Here you have the Canadian Prime Minister going to Parliament, which may or may not be diplomatic, but he did do it. You have the White House, the US White House, making these allegations against Indian intelligence agencies, a sealed indictment in a New York court as well, which is coming out in the public domain through some fairly well-reputed international newspapers. In the face of all of this, India has to really put its case much more forcefully. Firstly, make the case again and again that its concerns over the activities of whether it's Niger, whether it's Pannun, or all the other separatists and extremists on India's wanted list, that case has to be made in a much more forceful position. And I think there needs to be some understanding that this is not an issue that can just be wished away, or that if we stop talking about it, it can go away. Clearly, despite India's actions in terms of retaliation against Canada, against the expulsion of diplomats and shutting down of visas, that has not cut any ice. So I think it's necessary to take stock of just what has happened, and not to simply wish away allegations like this with the idea that there's no credible evidence yet.
Okay, Sanjay Lazar, the geopolitics is one part of the story, but for people like yourselves who have suffered personally, who have watched over the years Canadian governments shield Khalistani groups, including those responsible for the killing of your family on board the Kanishka plane. This moment, this article, which is focused once again, the allegation on an attempt to kill Gurpatwant Pannu, but not on why Pannu is not behind bars already. What do you say?
First of all, Barkha, I would just like to, I differ slightly with my esteemed guests on the panel. This is a case of your terrorist is a terrorist, and he's not a terrorist. My terrorist is a freedom fighter. Why hasn't the US done anything? This man has threatened Air India aircraft, the World Cup finals. You should have had him in jail, first of all. The second thing, he's broken all international laws. The second thing, I have not yet heard any Indian official source saying that this could be a non-state actor. It could be somebody from within the Indian setup outside. I have not seen that. But this makes me feel sick that they have seen over the last 38 years that there were people within their network. Now Terry is here, he can confirm. There was the US Secret Service in 1985, before the Kanishka, who went to Canada to meet Parmar to find out he wouldn't do any hanky-panky when Rajiv Gandhi landed in the US. You've had a series, they knew about Niger and Pannun's background. And the fact that they were making such outrageous claims, plus were part of the Khalistani groups. So, if they're not acting, I tend to believe what the Hindustan Times paper has said at some point that they've quoted somebody saying these guys could be CIA moles.
No, not somebody, not somebody.
Well,
They've quoted the National Security
Mr. Doha.
Advisor Ajit Doval, who hasn't gone on record to make this point, but the Hindustan Times did report that Ajit Doval, in a conversation with the CIA director, spoke about him being a CIA agent. Go ahead, Sanjay, complete your point,
Yes.
and then I'll go to
So
the others.
that's my
Yes.
point. So if he's a so it obviously shows that they're fully complicit in what's going on. I take Terry's point and the ambassador's point that it's embarrassing for India if we're involved. There is some level of maybe Indian, not government, but non-governmental involvement, so the sealed indictment would indicate. But why hasn't the US taken any action on his threats? What happened to the Patriot Act? What's happened to the Terrorism Act? What's happened to all these US statutes that they've got on place? Why isn't India pressing this?
Let me just briefly bring in Terry before I return to the others. Terry, I think for a lot of Indians, the Financial Times article has sparked a kind of debate which says that once again, the trope is about what some unnamed Indian/Indian agency is perhaps insinuated to have tried to do in this particular case. But no comment at all on why this man is not facing the law, the wrath of the law in either Canada or America.
It's a very good question, isn't it? And it's one that neither government has really answered. I mean, for years in Canada, going back 40 years to the Kanishka bombing of 1985, Canada has failed to act on legitimate requests by India, pointing to named terrorists that are wanted in India, and Canada has just shrugged. Oh, we don't want to take sides in an Indian squabble. We don't want to get involved in that. We're taking hands off. Maybe it's not serious. And then, of course, they found out it was very serious indeed. And most recently, in Pannun's remarks, very threatening remarks about Air India, about it being a risk to your life. You could endanger your life if you step on board an Air India flight. Well, that sounds very like what we heard just a couple of weeks before the bombing of the Kanishka in 1985, where people were told at the Gurdwara, don't fly Air India because it could risk your life. It could be unsafe to do so. That's a quote from what was actually said at the Gurdwara in the days ahead of that bombing. So make no mistake, this was really a threat. And to date, I've heard nothing from either the US or the Canadian government to suggest that we are taking this seriously and that this man should be charged or at least questioned about this. He says he has been questioned and said, no, there was no threat here. That's it. That's the investigation. That's not good enough for either the Americans or the Canadians. And obviously the Americans are taking action. They've sealed an indictment in this particular case about a death threat against Pannun. But what about the other side of the question? What are they doing about Pannun? And that question, I think, is just hanging in the air. And I think it's legitimate for the Indian side to raise that. At the same time, they've got to take seriously the other question, that who's going after Pannun? And how come the Americans, who previously said that they shared intelligence that corroborated the Canadian allegations, well, that fits perfectly with what we're hearing now, doesn't it? It fits perfectly with what maybe the information that they were referring to sounds like they had information that indeed there are plots against India's enemies going on in the US and Canada.
So one of the problems, Ambassador Sinha, is that there's very little, forget global awareness, even among Canadians. A poll actually showed how few Canadian citizens even knew about the Air India bombing, in which Sanjay Lazar, who's here on the program, lost his entire family, right? And this Angus Reid Institute poll revealed the fact that while we feel so strongly about it here in India, most people don't know who Nijjar is, who Pannu is, even though Pannu now acts with impunity from both Canadian and American soil. The problem, though, is as the world will now presumably talk more about the Financial Times article than they will about Pannun's open threat to Indian diplomats. How should India respond?
Well, yes, here I agree with Suhasini that we need to take up this matter more strongly, make the public better aware of the problems that we face. But I disagree with in case our people are involved, that any spy agency should be involved in extrajudicial killings. That is not good for the agency, is not good for its work, and it eventually backfires on the country itself. So if our people are involved, they should definitely get out of this business and focus more on explaining and building up public opinion both in India and outside. We did not take up the Air India case strongly enough when it happened in 1985. We let it pass. We should not have let it pass. We should have insisted on Canada taking action. And even today, in this case of Pannu, we should take it up at every meeting with the United States. It's important to get technical cooperation and investment, etc., etc. But it's equally important for us to take up publicly every time our leaders meet American leaders that people like Pannu must be put behind bars. I'll give you one example. Just today, our newspapers reported that is an Indian citizen in the UK who was arrested in April this year, charged by the Americans for having funded the Hezbollah. He was arrested in April, and today he's been extradited to the US. Within a matter of 6 months, this person charged in the UK is being extradited to the US. And here are Indians who have been, whom India has been asking for in Canada and the US for years, and they are not extradited. So these kinds of double standards have to be put in the open by India, and India's response should be diplomatic and public rather than trying to go for these underhand dealings like a la James Bond.
A la James Bond, on that question, before I go to Suhasini and Ambassador Puri, I have to ask you what you made of the Hindustan Times reference to Pannun being a CIA agent. And by the way, speculation of this kind has taken place before, after 26/11, around David Headley, a key perpetrator who was never handed over to India. This is not outside the realm of possibility, despite the James Bondish dimension to it, Ambassador Sinha. What did you make of that HD report? Ambassador Sinha, can you hear me?
Oh, well, the HT report, again, it is one of those things that I don't know how correct it is, but if it is correct, then obviously our people feel that this kind of information is useful domestically in building up support. That it builds the image, as I had mentioned in the case of the Canada dispute, our government had a win-win situation. If it was proved that the Indian government was behind the killing, then the government wins the next election hands down, because the public in India will very strongly support it. So I don't know what Justin Trudeau was thinking when he made the allegation, because in both situations, if he could not put forward any evidence, then he would have egg on his face. And if he actually put forward evidence that an Indian James Bond had gone and killed Niger, then the ruling party wins the next elections without any difficulty. So this is the kind of situation where domestically it helps the government to show that it's a tough government. It can take on and go and kill terrorists anywhere in the world.
So Suhasini, how does that influence the Indian response? And what do you make of the fact that the Foreign Ministry was quite different in its response to the Financial Times, even though that did not come from an official member of a government, compared to what Trudeau did? Now, of course, one has to qualify the fact that the FT article doesn't say Indian agencies were responsible. It doesn't spell out, the needle of suspicion is not pointed directly at anyone. Trudeau did that. But the Foreign Ministry has tried to suggest that this is gun runners, terrorists, and others, and it's taking the inputs very seriously. What did you make in terms of the comparisons between the responses to Trudeau and to the FT article?
Without getting into the semantics, Barkha, I think we have to be very clear about what India is being accused of here. It doesn't matter how the wording is put. It's very clear that India is being accused not just by Canada, but by the United States, of allowing its government agencies, its intelligence agencies, to carry out what Ambassador Sinha referred to as extrajudicial killings, or targeting people in an extrajudicial manner, in what are seen otherwise as Western countries or friendly countries. When there have been such reports in countries like Pakistan, for example, perhaps many have been able to turn a blind eye, firstly because of the history with Pakistan and Pakistan's own history of supporting groups that carry out terror attacks in India. But in these particular cases, we're not seeing the same. The second part, I think we have to also be clear that if the government's first reaction to a prime minister of Canada making this allegation, even though he couched it in credible allegations kind of wording, was to call it absurd, to call it motivated, to shut down all kinds of diplomatic ties, to shut down visas, to ask diplomats to leave. If that was the reaction to the Canadian allegations, then how is it that a day after the American allegations, that India is being so sanguine about it, or that the MEA is saying, yes, we are taking all of these inputs into consideration. It's a matter of national security for us. It should be a matter of national security if any agency of India is carrying out such activity without proper authorization. And if it does have authorization, then the government should simply say so. Say that these countries have refused to act against people we believe are going to target Indian citizens, and therefore our agencies have been empowered to do so, if that is in fact the case. I do think that it does not help India's case to have this kind of dual standard, one for Canada, one for the US. Finally, I would say that it seems a little baffling to me, when the previous Trudeau government, as in Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, refused to extradite Parmar to India. The Indian government had already started to take a very tough line on Canada in terms of political relations. Between 1973 and 2015, no Indian Prime Minister went for a bilateral visit to Canada. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh only went for a multilateral visit in 2010, I think, and that was only after the Prime Minister of the time, Stephen Harper, had actually carried out an elaborate apology for Canada's actions after the IC-182 Kanishka bombing. So the fact that we restarted political ties without actually getting what we had always been asking for, Canadian action against these groups that target India, that continue to threaten India, seems a bit puzzling to me. And given that it is now 8 years later, it seems a little difficult to understand. We just had a 2+2 with the United States. We've just had a 2+2 with Australia. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has just been to the United Kingdom. In each of these discussions, the issue of Khalistani separatism, Khalistani terrorism has been raised. And yet, we find just a few days later that these kind of allegations are still being made without any concern of, as you pointed out, of explaining why someone like Pannun can put out these threats and why someone can actually target Air India so specifically, giving a date and saying that nobody should take flights. I think there's a lot of explanation to be done by Western capitals over this issue, over their lack of action. But I don't understand particularly what our diplomacy is doing by having one reaction to one country, another reaction to another, and then continuing political relations with these countries as if nothing has changed.
So that's a very interesting question. Terry, you want to comment briefly? I was going to go to Ambassador Puri, but do go ahead, Terry.
I just want to cut in just a slight correction, if I may. And that is, there is a clear distinction to be drawn between the allegations made by the Canadians that the government of India was officially involved and sanctioned this killing of Nijjar, and the claims made by the United States State Department.
That's what I asked for Hasani, but she says the essence is the same. I think the argument she's making is that the essence is the same.
It may be the same, but the Americans are more discreet about their more diplomatic, more clever, if you like, about how they've raised this at the top level. Biden has allegedly raised it with Modi. So there's no question that they take it very seriously and they realize where the finger is being pointed. But it's not being pointed explicitly. It's somebody unspoken in this sealed indictment is alleged to have targeted Pannun. But we're not saying it was the Indian government. The Canadians did. Big difference.
Yeah.
So in the first case, obviously, India was insulted, got its back up. It's absurd. It's motivated, blah, blah, blah. They deny it all. This time, well, we'll contemplate it. They appreciate the American politeness.
Okay. Ambassador Puri, but let me ask the awkward question. To some degree, sorry. So, Hasani, did you have a two?
No, I'm just saying that, as I said, this is semantics. The Americans have accepted all the Canadian allegations. They have spoken about them themselves. So I don't know if the difference in whether it was put out diplomatically or not makes a difference. Clearly, the Financial Times article, which the White House seems to have confirmed, says very clearly that it is the Indian government's operatives in some way that are involved.
It doesn't use that language. It implies it. It doesn't use that language. So Hasni.
As I said, semantics.
Okay.
The White House would not be confirming these things if, in fact, they wanted to keep it under wraps, as Terry seems to be suggesting.
Let me bring in our diplomats, Ambassador Puri. But actually, my question was going to be that is there a sense of disappointment that India must feel with the United States of America? I remember one of our earlier programs, Ambassador Sinha made the point that India, must raise this strongly with the Americans. The 2+2 has just happened, and India did raise it. It was in the readouts and so on that followed. But then to have this article come out after that, even as a leak, and to remind our audience that the Canadians said it was the Americans that shared intelligence about the so-called India hand in the Niger killing under the Five Eyes grouping. Is there a sense that America doesn't have India's back on this, that in a way America is making light of India's concerns on terrorism?
Barkha, this is a very complex question, so allow me a minute or two. One, I like what Terry mentioned, but he used a different P word. I think let's use the more correct P word, which is power. And let's have no qualms. United States, Canada is Canada. Remember what Suhasini mentioned, that for years and years on end, we literally cut off Canada from our diplomatic action, activities, etc. So we did take action at those particular times. Things have moved on. I don't have to go into that. Neither do I want to go into domestic political kind of things, because that then muddies this entire discussion. Now, there is little doubt, for people like me who have been posted in the United States, Pannun and people like him were constant bugbears as far as we were concerned. I mean, we were too small a fry for him to, set out these summoned, etc., as it is called, but he would do it all the time, which would make life extremely difficult for all of us. The thing is, obviously, these chaps have been tolerated. But remember, in the systems, there are a number of sets of players who are important. Let me leave with you a kind of thought. Didn't do it? I don't think this kind of action is in the standard operating procedure for government of India and its institute. I don't think so. But I'm now a retired guy, what can I say? I just want to make one point. If in the Western world, or in fact in any world, if institutions and agencies which have, let me say, the ear of the senior most leadership, if they have a perspective, up to a point, other countries can kind of brush it aside, don't take it very seriously. But if it goes on and they feel that, look, we told you and you still did it, then, the person at the very top also feels obliged to go along with them because they matter more for him or her. And this is something that we all need to understand. Therefore, as Suhasini puts it, you're right. Legally, they have ways out and say something else, but the semantics are clear. Look at the headline. US want India. That's the headline of the Financial Times. Surely they know English, and surely they know what they've written there. So the fact of the matter is, yes, it compounds matters. Let's see how things work out, and our response has also been calibrated best possible manner in which it would. But these are matters which are par for the course and par for the course of the way things turn out. Now, you mentioned one more point, this thing about why did we not do anything much earlier and all, vis-a-vis Pannun, the United States, etc. Look, today many people would say we should have done much more. We never, for example, registered cases against these guys. We never made formal requests for them. But then do remember, Pannun is a US national. It's a case a bit different than what my colleague Barkha Sinha mentioned about an Indian national being extradited. These countries are quite wary about extraditing their own nationals. And there are various reasons for that. You can see this Rana's case, which everybody has agreed, and yet things keep finding one way or the other of something getting stuck. So I'm afraid we have to go through it. A degree of, let me say, not just embarrassment, but much more than that will have to be tackled. But I do think that relationship with the United States and so many other components, huge and massive components, that that this will also be, let me say, divergences are part of the huge convergences which are.
Yeah. So let me take that to Ambassador Sinha, the P word, power. That power actually also impacts how you respond to Canada and how you respond to the United States of America. Is that what's going on here, Ambassador Sinha?
Well, to a certain extent, certainly, that's absolutely correct. The fact is that India-US relations, which used to be extremely bad some decades ago, have come a long way. We now have an extremely good relationship going, and nobody in India would like the likes of Pannu, etc., to spoil that relationship. In the case of Canada, the situation was slightly different. One, of course, Canada is not the United States in terms of power. And the other is that Canada's record in supporting terrorists is much longer and much worse than that of the United States. In the case of the US, there are a few pinpricks here and there. But in the case of Canada, there's a deliberate policy, it seems, to promote these kinds of terrorists being given shelter in Canada. So I think the responses were different, as also the allegations, as rightly pointed out by Terry. The allegation made by Canada was absolutely direct. By the US, was certainly a little more subtle, a little more diplomatic than in the case of Canada. So I think our response was certainly measured. But I think we should cooperate with these countries to ensure that that they feel that we want to cooperate. And I think certainly in case there's any evidence of any of our rogue agents getting involved in this, we should take action, because it does not behove our country, and it's not good for our spy agencies themselves to get involved in such activities.
Sanjay, let me bring you in, and then I'll come to Suhasini and Terry for closing remarks. As someone who, as I said, has devoted your life to seeking elusive justice in the Kanishka bombing, I'm imagining that this conversation is somewhat very, when I say this conversation, I don't mean this program, but the global conversation is somewhat very isolating.
It is. It's deja vu, actually, for me, Barkha. When you go back to 1984, 85, and you look at the warnings that you got, not only in the month before the Kanishka, but a year before, and the acts of the Khalistanis hijacking planes and stuff like that. And then you see, guys who issued threats, and then our aircraft went down. I lost my family. Now you cut to today, and you see Pannun issuing threats, and I'm just baffled why the United States itself has not acted to uphold its own standing in the world community. It's their own citizen. It's exactly what I said. Your terrorist, is a terrorist, and mine is a freedom fighter. You spoke of Headley. He's attacked, my city, Mumbai, and he's sitting somewhere in a Chicago jail or whatever. They're not bringing him here. They're not arresting this guy. So it's I'm deeply distressed, of course, and I think it's time that Indian government also puts it, like Suhasini has said, put your case out strongly. The ambassadors have said India should be doing its bit to tell, point out sections. There are so many US sections I've mentioned before on your show, which this guy could have been clapped in irons. He should have been in Guantanamo Bay, according to me.
Yeah,
that's
I can only imagine what you must feel, Sanjay, you and other families. It must be absolutely gut-wrenching. So Hasani, I think that's the point, right? Like, the foreign ministry reaction said it took the inputs very seriously from the United States after the FT report, but did not really speak much about why this man is still free.
Well, I think there is, as Ambassador Sinha said, a certain compulsion, because our ties are actually quite good on every other respect. But I do feel that intelligence cooperation on issues like terrorism and terror threats is really intrinsic to our country. And is a very important part of any strategic relationship with any country that claims to be a good friend, as these countries do. I think, therefore, it's necessary to be a bit plain about what is actually going on over here, to not, as I said, brush it under the carpet and just deal with it in a kind of reactive manner, deciding how to react when Canada comes out in the open. But Canada says they were speaking to us for 3 months on the issue, reacting when the Financial Times comes out, but the US says that they raised these concerns in June of this year. I think we have to be much more proactive in understanding that there is an international attention on India's actions over this case. And it is also possibly the right time to explain India's case on a much more international stage without worrying about ruining friendships when friends are not worrying about the same kind of issue. So I think that there's a little more front foot batting that I would expect our government to do at this point, particularly because it's very clear after the Canadian allegations came out. Then you saw the Five Eyes come out with statements supporting Canada.
Yeah.
And now you see this US, whatever it is, the indictment plus the White House spokesperson's comments, however you want to read them. I think we have to accept the fact that this issue is not going away.
So, Terry, I want to end actually with what's happening with the Canadian investigation. What's going on?
Good question. I wish I knew, and I wish some of us knew something about this investigation. There's no excuse for the Trudeau government for refusing to put its cards on the table. They make excuses. Oh, well, it's classified. Yeah, well, we forget that. We all know that you've been bugging diplomats, and that the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance does that. It's no surprise to anybody at all. And they say, oh, well, we don't want to prejudice any future trial. Well, you've done that. The Prime Minister's got on his feet and said India's guilty. I mean, he's announced the conclusion of the investigation, if you like. Yeah. So these excuses don't wash. There's no reason for this complete failure of transparency. And so the Indian government's denials, they stand. I mean, they're not refuted by the Canadians. They've got to get into that game. They've got to put their cards on the table. But I say, in addition, that now that the Americans have weighed in on this, that now we're involved in this, we're pointing fingers, however subtly and politely we may do it, without overtly accusing the Indian government of being complicit in these murders, well, or plots of murder. Well, that changes the game. People are now, who initially said, well, Trudeau, you know, he's a bit flaky, he's a bit of an airhead. And believe me, there are some Canadians who feel that way. And now they're wondering, well, the Biden administration doesn't seem quite as flaky. And what about this unsealed? Now they're starting to believe that there may be smoke here, and maybe there's fire where there's smoke.
Well, with all the smoke and fire, I think the point is well taken about why the government is not making more noise about why Gurpatwant Pannun is still free. Why are we not hearing more on that? And I think that's a very important question that has been raised by almost everybody on this panel. And I think, as was mentioned by Suhasini, the issue isn't going away. The issue continues to be a live issue. Also, the impunity with which Pannun is able to operate is also a live issue. Neither of these issues is going away. We leave it there, and as they say, watch the space carefully to see what unfolds. To Terry, Ambassador Sinha and Puri, to Suhasini, and to Sanjay Lazar. Thank you to our audience as ever. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Mojo Story has always made a commitment to its viewers to go to where the story is. And as you can see here, we are at the epicenter of the Israel war on Gaza. We are right at the front line, about 1 mile from the Gaza Strip, as the Israeli military gets ready with its tanks and its gunners to begin its final frontal assault that will take troops into Gaza. As we said, we are not like other organizations. We believe in giving you all sides of the story objectively and as much as possible from the ground. And that's exactly what we're doing here, covering the biggest global story today from the epicenter of the war zone. So please, we need your support. Support us, become a Mojo member, subscribe to us, spread the word, and thank you for your support.